Alright, so here now we're going to take our first notes in zoology, and most of us, or some of us, were here the first day, and we kind of went over exactly what zoology means. Perhaps you already know, but zoology is really the study of animals. And zoology is just a branch. Like we see here, there's many different branches, but a branch of biology. And we can look at ecology, genetics, microbiology, anatomy. We could do botany, which is plants, ichthyology, which is fish, and so on. But biology is the study of life. And then if we break it down into these different branches, we can study the ecology, the environment, and the factors that affect that living thing in where it lives. Microbiology, or organisms that can only be seen with a microscope, really small. It's the study of really, really small life. Anatomy is the study of the organs and the makeup of an organism. And then zoology is animals. So the one fundamental question, though, we really need to answer when we first begin is, so what is it that makes something life or alive? And there's really some basic characteristics. Now, you might find that some people say there's 5, and some people say there's 4, whatever they may say. And let me erase these here. But really, there's 8 things you always want to be cognizant of when you're talking about life. In order to go over these, not too long, but you probably should have some understanding of these already. Probably the most important thing is that all living things are made up of cells. Now, if you find something on the ground, you're not sure if it's a rock or if it's non-living or living. If you pick it up and you look at it and you put it under a microscope and it has cells, you know it's living. If it doesn't have cells, it's not alive. So, and there's a lot of things, that normal things we might think of as making something alive, like movement, aren't necessarily needed for something to be considered alive, but cells are. It's vital. Okay? And then the next one is to reproduce. So in order for something to be a living thing, it has to be able to produce offspring. And that can be through asexual or sexual means. Sexual just means organisms produce gametes, which are an egg and sperm, and then those two come together and they form a zygote, which is a single-celled organism that it then eventually develops into the more complex organism. But it starts out, if you're sexual, with gametes, sperm and egg. Asexual is a little different, and that's in that the original organism splits in two, or a piece breaks off, or whatever it may be. But the main difference is, so splits. And this is fission, just breaks in two. But gametes, the difference in here, though, for something for asexual, it has to be a pretty simple organism, because for something to just split in two and have two complete organisms quickly without a lot of energy, it's not very possible. It's not very likely if you're a very complex organism like a human. Some just split down the middle, the right side and the left side, and you just produce a new organism. It just doesn't work like that. And usually these are small organisms, bacteria, some protists, but very simple organisms. Now, the sexual is much more complex. The sperm and egg come together, they form this zygote. The zygote then immediately starts splitting and producing many cells. And this is really, sexual you think multicellular, asexual you usually think of unicellular. But important, if something's alive, it must reproduce. And then we have something called the Universal Genetic Code, and that's really talking about DNA. You look at something and you say, does it have DNA? If it has DNA, it's alive. And no matter what it is, whether it's a bacteria, whether it's a sea star, whether it's a human, a dog, a cat, a fly, whatever it is, they all have DNA. It's really basically the same. So there's this basic blueprint that all living things have. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. So universal genetic code. And then also these organisms grow and develop. So they have like a lifespan. A good example is like a frog. So it has an egg, and then it has tadpole, TP, and then it has a frog. And then the frog is the adult. And you can see this in insects and so on. Okay. So grow and develop. There's life stages of an organism if it's alive. Okay. And then we have this next part, and this is obtain and use energy, materials for energy. And this is really two things: photosynthesis, P, and then the other one is cellular respiration, CR. So all of the energy we have in our environment comes from photosynthesis. Now we can't photosynthesize, so we have to eat organisms that can. So maybe we don't necessarily directly eat them, and maybe we eat some of them like a salad or whatever, or some kind of vegetable. But also we eat other things like beef and caribou and moose. They eat the plants. They get the energy, then we eat them, and that's where we get our energy. But in some indirect way, we get it from plants through photosynthesis. But then the breaking down of that energy is a process called cellular respiration. All living things do it. Okay, they might not do it exactly the same though. Some have a process where they depend on photosynthesis, but there also is chemiosynthesis, where organisms don't depend on the sun. They live in places where there is no sun, and instead they use minerals or elements from the water and break that down for energy, produce their energy that way. Okay. And also respond to the environment. All organisms can, if something happens, they can respond to it. A really good example is, plant. You might think a plant can't really respond, but if you've ever watched your plant, when the sun comes out, it bends itself towards it, and it has to do with the cells and accumulating water in one side of the cell and making the cells tight and no water in the others, and it bends it that way. But there's lots of different ways this can happen, but all organisms tend to respond to their environment. Things that happen, they can respond. And then these last two, homeostasis, this is one we might probably, or we probably look at this. It's this really big word, homeostasis, but it means keep a stable internal state. So a good example is Alaska. We live here and it's really cold. And so when we go outside, if it's really cold, we got to put a coat on. But say it's like 40 degrees, okay? And so we need to run around, we need to do things to keep ourselves warm, okay? And that's really our way of responding and keeping our environment stable. Like if you ever checked a person's temperature, most people are around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? And there's also pH levels. They all tend to stay the same for living things. And if something happens to this one, or something happens to this one, it can be very harmful to the organism. So our body tries to keep temperature the same, pH the same, as well as other things. That's called homeostasis. Now the last one is change over time. So organisms can change as the environment changes. So it's more a wholesale thing instead of responding to your environment like a thing that's much more short term. But long term, as your environment changes, I'm going to erase some of these. So the temperature changes quite a bit over so many years, and then you have to be able, the organism has to be able to respond or it will die. So built into organisms is this ability. So, and this is where we talk about in biology, but it has to do with variation. So if you ever look at humans, are a really good example. No two humans are the same exactly, unless they're twins. But variation exists in humans, in all animals. And so they're not all exactly the same, and some have some traits that are a little bit different. So as things change, some traits that organisms have are better suited, and those ones might survive compared to those that don't have that same trait. Now humans are a little different because we don't really depend on this, because we can engineer and we can do things, and some animals actually can engineer things as well. But we have this just amazing capacity to think and learn, and so this one isn't such a big deal for us. We can, even if we don't have traits, we can make things that help us do it. Okay, and really change over time can be macro. This is wholesale change where one organism becomes a different organism, and micro is where you respond to just a change in the environment. And in biology, we'll talk about the peppered moths, how they changed their color. They didn't really not become a moth anymore. They were still a moth, and they really looked very much the same, but their color changed a little bit as the environment changed. Okay, so these are the 8. I'm sorry, I was going to say 7, and you might be able to take some of these and meld them into each other. So respond to the environment, homeostasis. Maybe they're the same, and then whatever. Native cells how about another one here? Obtain and use materials for energy, homeostasis. Maybe they're the same thing. Maybe they could actually fit in the same. But really, 8 is a good number. Just try to remember these. Okay. And the last thing we want to talk about here, these notes, is the idea of level of organization. So all living things have this, and they go from very simple, maybe unicellular things, to more complex organ systems. So you have these basic molecules, these organic molecules that make up all living things. You have proteins, you have nucleic acids, you have carbohydrates, and those. And all living things are made up of those, whether it's an insect or a human. And they all have this basic structure that they share. But then some become very complex, like a human or a dog, and some aren't so complex, like a bacteria. But you have this organization, simple, and it becomes more and more complex. And you can think of like a single organism, just by itself, like a bacteria. Okay, there's a little dot with a DNA in here, maybe a few ribosomes, maybe some cilia on it. Pretty simple, not much to it. Okay. But then you have the biosphere, where you have the bacteria, it lives on a human, the humans in here, you have some other organisms interacting with the humans, and all of the living things on the earth. So we're going to kind of talk about this level of organization as we go through. But really we're talking about a cell to the biosphere. And in between here we have tissue, then we have organs and organ systems and so on. That's kind of the level of organization that I'm talking about. So those are your intro notes. Hopefully a lot of it's been reviewed and you've heard some of this before, and this was just bringing it back to mind. Let me know if you have any questions, and see you in class.